Hey, Shalom Shalom Israel. We're back with counting to Shabuot, or the Feast of Weeks. This is part 2, and I'm going to leave a link below to a website that will have all these teachings, but also will have some very important study material. It will have an article by TorahCalendar.com on how to count the Omer that will go in a lot more detail than I'm going to go into, and also a great article by Todd Bennett, the author of the Walk in the Light series. He's also written an article that is quite different, but also on the subject of counting to Shabuot and how to do that. So hopefully these videos will be more concise and just listing the points that we really need to understand to get the information we need to reach Shabuot, which is one of Yah's appointed times listed in Leviticus 23, which we're looking at right now. Now, the reason why I'm spending the time doing this is because, quite honestly, not too many people understand the death, burial, and resurrection of Yahushua Messiah. And over the years, I've noticed that the reason why they don't understand that is because they don't understand how to count the Omer or know when to start the count. And that's what we're going to be getting into today a little bit as we look at this. So this is why this subject is so important, why I'm trying to go over and over again, because not too many people have a good understanding of that. So or understanding of this, and so that's what we're spending the time walking through this, so we can actually arrive at the feast at the appointed time. So I drew up a little bit of an overview of what we're going to be looking at, Leviticus 23, 1 through 22, and we've already covered the first 8 verses, where the first 4 verses kind of started off with Yah's appointed times, starting with the weekly Sabbath. Verses 5 through 8 were introduced to Passover and the Festival of Unleavened Bread. Now, the reason why I started from the beginning of this chapter is because it actually, in verse 7, it tells us that the first day of unleavened bread is a high Sabbath, and the last day, the 7th day of unleavened bread, is also a day of no work, or a high Sabbath. And this is important to understand because today we're going to be looking at verses 9 through 11, and which deal with the wave offering. This is really important because this is when we start our count to Shabuot. But if we don't realize the Sabbath in question, that there was two other Sabbaths mentioned besides the weekly Sabbath, we may be thrown off and see the word Sabbath and just be thinking the 7th day of the week, the Shabbat. The weekly Sabbath. But in reality, I'm going to just tell you straight up from the beginning of this study that the Omer, the wave offering, is on day 16 of month 1. Always. It's fixed to that date. Day 16 of month 1. Now, with that being said, now I'm going to have to explain that and use the scripture, and that's what we're going to really be doing, is showing you scripture after scripture after scripture that proves that point, that the Sabbath in question in verse 11 is actually the high Sabbath of the 15th, and the morrow after the Sabbath is the 16th. And hopefully by the end of this series, you're going to understand this a lot better. We will also look at verses 12 through 14, which talk about the harvest, especially when coming into the land. Another major proof text we'll look at is Joshua, which also Joshua has the same name as Messiah. It's spelled Yod-He Shin, Yod-He Wa Shin Ayin in the Hebrew, and that's Yahusha. In 2 places actually has an extra Wa, which is Yahushua in that case. But Yahusha shows up more than any other form in the scripture, and that's the name of Joshua. But in Joshua chapter 5, it actually lays out, again, it shows you when this Omer count actually is. And we'll get into that next time. Verses 15 through 16, we're going to look at the 7 perfect Sabbaths and the 50 days. And here's just a little question to get your mind thinking. How many days is 7 perfect Sabbaths, or 7 completed Sabbaths? This is actually not a trick question, but think about that. How many days is 7 perfect Sabbaths? We'll also look at the Exodus account, when we the giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai, we actually find out something very interesting, just hidden right in the text that tells us what day this event took place. We will also talk about why this is important in regards to the resurrection, the Sabbath resurrection of Yahushua Messiah, because it tells us that he rose on the first Sabbath. So we'll get into this more, but the Sabbath resurrection is actually a major proof text that lines up with the rest of Scripture that shows you that the Omer count starts on the 16th. We'll also look at Luke 6:1 and some other places. Verses 17 through 19, we're going to look at the priest and the offerings on for this festival, the Feast of Weeks, first fruits. And we'll also look in the renewed covenant writings and see how the priests during the Second Temple time, how they were keeping this appointed time. And we're going to look at some, even some historical information, and look at Apostle Paul. A lot of people read 1 Corinthians 15 and think Apostle Paul is teaching something quite different than what the Scripture actually teaches. And we're going to look and see how he actually kept this feast as well, which lines up with Messiah and everyone else, what the priests were doing. And finally, we'll wrap up with verses 20 through 22, and really look at the big picture of the Festival of Weeks. And we'll also look at things that happened in the past, obviously, on Mount Sinai in Acts chapter 2, and ultimately the things to come. What is this feast is a shadow of? What's to come? So that's what we're going to be looking at. I just wanted to put that out front so you can kind of get the big picture, because if I start just going through these one by one, you may not understand that there's a lot of evidence showing when this count is, and I'm only doing a few of them. In the articles I mentioned, it goes in a lot more detail, so I highly encourage you to read those, look up those scriptures, and look up every word. Look them up in, whether you're using eSword, Blue Letter Bible, Bible Hub, whatever, look up those words, study this out. Now, today we are going to be reading, we're looking at the Omer wave offering, verses 9 through 11. It is written, "And Yahuwah spoke to Moshe, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, and you shall say to them, When you come into the land which I give you, and shall reap its harvest, you shall bring a sheaf, or a Omer, of the first fruits of your harvest to the priest. And he shall wave the sheaf before Yahuwah for your acceptance. On the morrow after the Sabbath, the priest waves it." Now, today we're going to be really focusing in on this first fruits, when the harvest is getting ready to begin. This is what this is all about. The priest waves this Omer. Now, Deuteronomy 16:9 states this. Count 7 weeks for yourself. Begin to count 7 weeks from the time you begin to put the sickle to the grain. So it's talking about this harvest time. So what I just read with the priest waving this at the beginning of the harvest this is when we start our count. 7 sevens, or 7 weeks. And and we'll get into the words behind this maybe later on to kind of focus in on the 7 sevens, or 7 weeks, the 7 Sabbaths, and the 50 days in more detail. We talked about that time bridge in part 1, and we'll be looking at it closer as we go through. But that's the big thing. That's why this is important to look at this today, because it starts the Omer count, and that's where the problem is. Everyone's not starting at the right place, and we're ending up in different locations. So the verse of debate is actually verse 11. I just want to show you, this is the scripture version. That's what I was reading from a second ago. And there is another version, the Septuagint, which was written about 1,000 years before the received text was finally finished, I should say. And this is an older version. It was the Old Testament written in Greek, or the Torah written in Greek. But nevertheless, the way verse 11 reads in the Septuagint is a little bit different than the Masoretic text and how it's translated in most translations. But it can give great insight to answer a very important question. We're trying to figure out what morrow after the Sabbath. We got to find out the Sabbath to figure out the morrow after the Sabbath. So again, I just want to make mention of this. There's already been 3 Sabbaths mentioned. In verse 3, we had the weekly Sabbath. In verse 7, the first day of unleavened bread. In verse 8, we had the 7th day of unleavened bread. So the question always comes up, which one is it? And there's people that support each view. And I would say the most common view is people think this is referring to the weekly Sabbath. But when we look at the Septuagint version here, we see that the way it's translated, it says, on the morrow of the first day. So, on the morrow after the Sabbath, on the morrow of the first day. First day here, Sabbath here. And it sounds like a contradiction at first until you go back and look at the context of Leviticus 23:7, where it says, on the first day, you have a set-apart gathering. You do no servile work. This is a direct reference, really, to what's going on here. This is also the Sabbath in question. Verse 7 is tying into verse 11 here. So, long story short, this is just one scriptural proof text that shows the Sabbath in that verse 11 is equal to the first day of the Septuagint version, which is talking about the first day of unleavened bread. So what does this mean? It means that the morrow after the Sabbath is the 15th day of the first month, the morrow after the Sabbath is the 16th. So it is completely fixed to the festival unleavened bread that will connect with the festival of weeks. So when we come back, we're going to continue our look at verses 12 through 14 and the book of Joshua and see more examples of the 16 starting our count and we arriving at Shabuot. I hope this helps. These examples are going to be pretty simple and straightforward, and you're going to be able to go back and search this out for yourself. If you don't have a Septuagint, you can look it up online and look and see what these things say. Again, look up the references that I'll link below. But this is a very important subject. If we're going to understand the appointed times, if we're going to understand the death, burial, and resurrection of Yahushua Messiah, we've got to understand how to count the Omer. Shalom.